Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just going to get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below there. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's that comment section down there. And don't forget to hit that like button as well. Today we are going to be doing our Ghostly Echoes series, and we had been going through the province of Alberta. I have now finished up Alberta, and we are moving west to British Columbia, also known as BC. So those will be the next series of ghost stories that we'll be covering starting this episode. We'll see how far we get with those, and I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place in Fernie, British Columbia. Fernie Folklore. The heritage of the town of Fernie in the Elk Valley in the southeastern British Columbia is tied to a piece of ghostly folklore. Legend tells us that in the late 1890s, during one of his expeditions to the area, prospector William Fernie, after whom the town is named, noticed an unusual piece of jewelry around a First Nations maiden's neck. The necklace was made of shiny black stones, which he recognized as being coal, a mineral that he had been searching for. If he could find the cache that those nuggets came from, Fernie was sure that he would become very wealthy. The would-be miner's inquiries indicated that the maiden wearing the pieces of coal was the chief's daughter. He approached the tribal leader and asked where the chunks had been found. The girl's father apparently decided that if the white man's agenda was going to be satisfied, his would be too. The native leader proposed that he and Fernie enter into something of a partnership. The chief would show the explorer where the coal had been mined if, in return, William Fernie would take his daughter's hand in marriage. Fernie initially agreed to the bargain, but as soon as he learned the location of the valuable natural resource, he went back on his word. The chief and his daughter were both angry and insulted. Not only had the white man failed to deal honorably, he had also offended them. The native leader responded by placing a curse on the settlement that bore the prospector's name. He decreed that fire, flood, and famine would ensue. In order to be certain that even insensitive white people would never be able to forget the inexcusable wrong perpetrated by their forefather, the chief created a permanent reminder on Mount Hosmer. According to the Fernie Chamber of Commerce, the ghost rider of Mount Hosmer can be seen each sunny summer evening on a rock face high above the city. The ghost is a spectacular shadow in the form of an Indian princess sitting on a horse with her father, the chief walking beside her, leading the horse. Even without such a dramatic visual reminder of the curse, it is unlikely that anyone could have doubted the effectiveness of the chief's power. The first devastating fire burned through the burgeoning community of 1904, 7 years after the invective had been issued. 4 years later, when Fernie had recovered from the devastation of the first fire, a forest fire spread to the town and all but destroyed it. Next came the threatened flood. In 1916, the Elk River overflowed its banks, flooding parts of the beleaguered settlement. In the 1930s, the Great Depression, although worldwide, had such a profound effect on the Elk Valley area that many Fernie residents concluded that their suffering was a further effect of the chief's curse. The spirit of the wrong chief finally had the attention of the townsfolk, but it took a further 30 years before his specter would be laid to rest and the curse lifted. On August 15th, 1964, at a ceremonial assembly, Kootenai Chief Ambrose Gravel, Chief Red Eagle, invited Fernie Mayor James White to join him in smoking the peace pipe, symbolically signifying a final resolution between the two groups and at last lifting the curse. Although an accord now exists between the non-natives and the natives in the area, some versions of this ghostly legend indicate that the tale is so accepted in local lore that First Nations people will still only camp overnight in the area when there is absolutely no alternative. In this way, and through the shadowy reminder on Mount Hosmer, the ghost of the chief and his daughter remain presences in the area. This story takes place near Cache Creek, British Columbia. Haunted Hat Creek Ranch. Hat Creek Ranch, located on the Caribou Wagon Road, built between New Westminster and Barkerville, had already had a long and colorful history, even before it became a stopping place for miners on their way to strike it rich. The land where the ranch is now, and its surroundings, had previously been used as Hudson Bay Company's pasture land. By the late 1860s, it had been settled by those with an eye to exploiting the thousands of fortune seekers who'd been passing through. Business boomed, and by 1872, an entrepreneur had constructed a roadhouse to provide travelers with food and overnight accommodation. However, the venture was perhaps not as safe an endeavor as the owner might have hoped it would be. By the time that the fortune seekers reached the Hat Creek area, anyone who were not a tough sort to begin with had certainly become that way. Fights and brawls were everyday occurrences, and it's unlikely that much attention was paid to a formal justice system when settling disagreements. This was, after all, the Wild West. Such a traumatic past has left psychic scars on the buildings at Hat Creek Ranch, scars that can still be seen, heard, and felt today in the form of ghosts. The very haunted ranch is a provincial historic site, and as such, receives visitors from all over the world every year. Many of those tourists report that the visit was especially memorable because they encountered at least one paranormal presence. Not all of these paranormal encounters left those who'd experienced them feeling warm and comforted, however. The footsteps that are heard on the second floor of the former roadhouse are usually followed by the sounds of doors slamming. Moments later, a female voice has been heard crying out for help. The voice may have been a ghostly reverberation belonging to a manifestation that has been seen on more than one occasion in a particular upstairs room. The apparition, an elderly woman with her hair tied up in a neat bun, apparently sits knitting in a rocking chair. This ghost may be the same one that was seen by a worker after hearing footsteps traveling along a hallway. When he looked out of his office to see who was there, he was only able to catch a glimpse of black and white apparel before the image and the sounds vanished. Much scarier, the presence on the back stairs has been neither seen nor heard, but is the one of the most dreaded spirits at the Hat Creek Ranch. It causes people to feel that their safety is in jeopardy, as it creates the sense that they are about to be pushed down the stairs. On the lower level of the building, glasses in the bar area move about mysteriously, as do solid blocks of wood that have been carefully placed to serve as doorstops. Many folks have reported something tugging at their clothing at the same time as a chilly and unexplainable draft wafts past them. People have also had experiences on the property surrounding the ranch buildings. In the barn, horses have been observed becoming distressed at the sound of coughing, but the animal's reaction is most understandable. given that no such distinctive sound had come from any live person present. Outside, the phantom hoof beats of long-dead horses are routinely heard trotting along the road before turning and making their way into the barn. Perhaps there the ghost horses will be reshod by the ghosts of the blacksmith. His hammer is often heard clanking on metal, accompanied by the hissing of air escaping from the bellows used to fan the flames of the forge. A worker who was living with his family at the ranch was not the least bit concerned when his preschool-aged daughter acquired what he took to be an imaginary playmate. One day when the family was outside, however, the man's composure was shaken. There, in front of one of the buildings, just for an instant, appeared the image of a little girl. As his eyes struggled to make sense of the sight, his ears were attending to his little daughter's excited voice, advising her parents, "There's my friend," while pointing at the tiny entity. The most gruesome ghost at Hat Creek is in the granary. History records that a man hanged himself there many years ago. Today, the vision of the lifeless body can still be seen dangling from the rafters at the end of his homemade executioner's noose. It would seem that perhaps the entire ranch property continues to feel the effects of its tragic past. This story takes place in Victoria, British Columbia. Royally haunted. The McPherson Playhouse is administratively associated with Victoria's equally haunted Royal Theatre on Broughton Street. This link means that employees from one venue sometimes get asked to work at the other. As a result, at least one unsuspecting worker got the ghostly fright of his life. A regular McPherson employee, Blair Morris, was assisting at the Royal during a busy time in 1988. He was locking up the unfamiliar venue when he crossed the stage. He suddenly felt as though someone had stabbed him in his back. When Morris reported the frightening incident to Larry Eastick, a worker more familiar with the Royal, the latter listened with the compassion born of experience. Over the years, many people had suffered the same horrible feeling in exactly that same spot. The regular employees had developed a routine of working in pairs, which they found helped them to avoid becoming psychic stabbing victims. This buddy system also allowed them to alleviate the usually more subtle but also more pervasive and sometimes overwhelming feeling that they were not welcome in the theater after closing time. In 1990, a nighttime custodian working on the theater's main floor happened to glance up at the balcony area. He was more surprised to see a man up there. The place was supposed to have been empty at that hour. However, since the theater was being used as a venue for a series of televised religious services at the time, the cleaner assumed that someone involved in the production had fallen asleep in one of the seats. He immediately headed upstairs to help the man find his way out. Despite a thorough search, first the balcony area and then the remainder of the theater, the custodian could not find another human being in the building. Assuming that the straggler had found his own way out, the cleaner continued with his duties. Moments later, he looked up toward the balcony for a second time. There, once again, was the man. This time, the custodian ran to the balcony in order to apprehend the intruder. However, when he got there just seconds later, there was no sign of anyone, nor any sign that anyone had been there. The terrified worker fled the building. Since that ghostly incident, all routine cleaning at the Royal has been done during the daylight hours. This story takes place around Kamloops, British Columbia. 3 old ghost stories. When he died in 1954, at the age of 92, retired railroad employee Matthew Fulton Crawford took a piece of history with him. He was the last remaining survivor of those who had attended ceremonial driving of the Canadian Pacific Railway's last spike in 1885. Fortunately for ghost story lovers everywhere, he left behind accounts of a few of his stranger experiences while working along that first ribbon of steel that connected our country from sea to sea. These stories have become legendary among railway crews as proof that the bond among them extends beyond the world that the rest of us know. In the spring of 1895, Crawford was piloting his steam train from Kamloops southward to North Bend, which is about midway between Lytton and Yale. Much to the entire crew's relief, the trip had been uneventful so far. The section of track that they were just about to leave led through some dangerous curves with steep drop-offs. In addition, it was common for patches of that section to be blocked by avalanches, mudslides, or fallen boulders. On this particular day, just as the sun set to the west, a heavy rain began to fall. In unspoken agreement, the crew's level of vigilance picked up as the skies darkened above them. Crawford and his firemen exchanged simple, nearly meaningless acknowledgments about the weather as they continued about their duties. They'd all been through far worse weather, but despite the apparent ordinariness of the situation, Crawford found himself becoming inexplicably apprehensive. His nerves were too taut to continue anything even resembling banter with his trusted and long-standing partner, the fireman. They worked on in silence until a voice screamed, "Stop! Don't go any further." Whirling around in his chair, Engineer Crawford screamed back, "Why, what do you see?" "Nothing," came the surprised-looking fireman's reply, for the warning had not been his, and he hadn't heard it. Why did you order me to stop, then?" Crawford demanded in a high-pitched, stressed-sounding voice. "I didn't say anything, Matt. Relax. You're letting your nerves get the best of you." "Everything's all right," the fireman advised. Not content this time to take his partner's word for it, Matthew Crawford thrust his head out the cab window. Although he could see nothing in the inky blackness, he certainly heard something. It was that voice again. This time it was shouting even louder, only one word, over and over again, "Stop! Stop! Stop!" Unable to disregard these clear instructions, Matthew Crawford applied the brakes as briefly as he felt was safe. "What are you doing, Matt? We're making good time." "Don't throw us off schedule," the fireman tried to reason with the nearly panicked engineer. As the train ground to a complete halt, Crawford grabbed a lantern and jumped down from his cab. By this time, the crew from the cars further back in the train had made their way forward to ask what was going on. "He's hearing voices," the fireman said, with a disparaging gesture towards the engineer out on the tracks. As their curiosity had aroused, and since there was nothing to be gained by staying in the train, two of the crew joined Matt Crawford out on the tracks. Moments later, the trio stood stock still and stared in disbelief. There, just ahead, a rock slide had ripped the track to shreds. Below roared the mighty Fraser River. It would have been certain death to all on board had Matthew Crawford not obeyed the phantom voice's instructions. The supernatural presence that warned the engineer of the danger ahead didn't make itself visible that night, but it didn't have to, for it had made itself heard. More importantly, its advice had been heeded, but just in time. The next year, Matthew Crawford had another psychic experience in almost exactly the same spot, but this time while he was heading his train eastward towards Kamloops. By coincidence, on this night, Crawford's brother-in-law, a young man named John Ladner, was his fireman. In this instance, it was not Crawford, but the fireman who was suffering the sense of impending doom. In grave contradiction to the man's usually upbeat mood, the trip was progressively uneventful until, without warning, the emergency signal sounded loudly throughout the line of cars, from caboose to engine. It could mean only one thing. Somehow a break had occurred somewhere in the train. It seemed a strange point in the route for such a thing to occur, but all the experienced hands on boards were grateful that if it had to happen, at least it had happened at this point in the trip. Just ahead was a particularly dangerous stretch. The engineer began to slow the train in preparation for fixing the problem. However, when the crew members tried to sort out among themselves just who it was that had pulled the cord to sound the alarm, or discover where the supposed break was, no one knew anything about it. After checking all the freight cars for any possible stowaways, the group came to the conclusion that they'd suffered some sort of a mass auditory hallucination and had just thought they heard the alarm. All of the crew members resumed their positions in the train, but just as Matthew Crawford reached for the throttle to bring the train back up to speed, the alarm sounded a second time. "Stop, Matt," his brother-in-law screamed before crying, "Jump, we're going to hit." Knowing better than to question what was happening, Matthew Crawford followed directly on Jack Ladner's heels. A second later, the cab crashed into a pile of rocks that blocked the tunnel entrance just ahead. Both Crawford and Ladner were injured, and the rest of the crew were shaken up, but thanks to an unseen entity that had twice sounded the alarm going, at least no one had been killed. It was some time before Jack Ladner was well enough to return to work, but once he did, he was happiest when he was back in partnership with his brother-in-law, Matthew Crawford. On the evening of Thursday, January 21st, 1904, although they were not working together, they anticipated seeing one another. Crawford would be in his passenger train, and Ladner was assigned to the auxiliary engine responsible for providing additional power to any train that needed help reaching the Rogers Pass summit in the Rockies. Their schedules indicated that they had been in the station at field at the same time. The two men greeted each other warmly. Crawford proudly showed Jack a watch that he had just purchased and explained that its accuracy was guaranteed for life. Because Matthew Crawford intended to use the watch for work, he had chosen one that had used the 24-hour clock to correspond to the railroad schedules. After the timepiece had been duly admired and discussed, the two exchanged information about the terrible winter storm that seemed to be brewing all about the area. As the older of the pair, Matthew Crawford took it upon himself to advise Jack of the possible safety measures that the younger man might want to avail himself of as he traversed steep inclines in a raging blizzard. Jack acknowledged his friend's well-meant words and assured him that there was no need to worry. Not only was Jack confident about his own abilities, he was confident about the equipment that he was charged with operating. As they bid each other a good night, Jack called out, "If I don't get there safely, I'll find a way to let you know." "Forget that, just be careful," Crawford admonished before climbing into his cab seat and heading out on the next leg of his run. Once the trip was underway, Crawford and his crew ate a hearty meal. The engineer took out his new watch to show it around for all to admire. After bragging about its reputedly accurate timekeeping qualities, he was shocked to notice that it wasn't reading the correct time at all. The watch was stopped at 19:56, 4 minutes before 8 o'clock in the evening. While the sounds of his crew's teasing faded into the background, Matt Crawford carefully inspected his newly purchased timepiece. He tried to wind it, he tried to adjust it, but nothing did any good. The watch continued to read 19:56. Concerned now that the implications of the stopped watch were more ominous than anything to do with its quality, Crawford stared straight ahead and said nothing until they reached the next station on the line. There, a terrible message awaited him. Jack's engine had met with a dreadful accident. Despite the younger man's experience and care, as well as the safety features incorporated into both the track and the engine. The engine had plummeted out of control, off the tracks, and into a boulder. There was no sign of either Jack or the firemen. It took an experienced rescue party 3 days before they found the bodies in the mangled remains. The searchers discovered that the glass covers on Jack's watch and the clock in the engine had both shattered with the impact, and that both devices had stopped at exactly 4 minutes before 8 o'clock in the evening, precisely the same time that Matthew's new watch had frozen. Crawford slowly realized exactly what had happened. Just as he had promised, Jack Ladner had sent his beloved brother-in-law a final message by stopping that new watch at the precise moment of his own death. For those 3 days while Jack's body was missing, all 3 timepieces, Jack's watch, the clock in the cab of the wrecked engine, and Matthew Crawford's new watch, had read exactly the same time. As salvage crews disassembled the twisted remains of the wreck, the hands of the clock inside began to move. Matthew Crawford removed Jack Ladner's watch from his body, set the time correctly, and wound it. To Crawford's utter amazement, the mechanism functioned as though nothing had happened. Crawford's own watch, however, the one that he had recently purchased, and that had been so highly recommended by the jeweler, never worked again. The hands remained frozen at 1956. From that day onward, Matthew Crawford wore Jack Ladner's watch, but he also kept his own broken one for the rest of his life. He never wavered from his conviction that as his brother-in-law's spirit was leaving its earthly body, it had stopped his new watch as a sign. This story takes place in Vancouver, British Columbia. The Wrath of Kandahar, despite numerous attempts to do so, have been unable to validate the authenticity of this ghost story. Even though the tale may be a work of fiction, I've decided to conclude it in this collection. At the very least, it's an enchanting legend, and in light of similar stories that I've been told, it is more than possible that the following events did happen just exactly as the journalist who wrote it in the story for the Vancouver Sun magazine in January 1949 said that they did. On a chilly Friday evening during January 1938, a group of skiers gathered to socialize in the chalet high atop Grouse Mountain, just to the north across Burrard Inlet from downtown Vancouver. It was a beautiful, clear night. Moonlight reflected against the deep blanket of fresh snow, making the areas that were bare of trees nearly as bright as day. The most challenging ski runs are those that work their way through stands of trees so dense that direct sunlight cannot penetrate to the trails. The Kandahar was no exception. Everyone who had gathered around the roaring fire in the chalet's fireplace was looking forward to a full weekend of skiing. Friendly wagers were exchanged as to who would be the first one down the Kandahar run in the morning. It was considered an honor to be the one to blaze the twisting, turning trail of pristine white powder. The importance of this friendly rivalry meant that all but the die-hard partiers retreated to their beds early that night. Everyone wanted to be refreshed for a full Saturday of skiing, and possibly even more awake early enough to claim the first swoosh down the mountain. By midnight, only a handful of partiers were left in the central cabin. Those who remained on the magical night were rewarded with a sight that they'll never forget. First one person, and then another, caught a glimpse of a darkened silhouette as it skied past the chalet window. Amazed at what they thought they'd seen, the members of the little group ran to the door and out onto the deck. They stared in wonderment and disbelief as they watched the figure of a skier swoosh down the mountainside at breakneck speed towards the trail through the forest. Impossible was the first word spoken by the witnesses. 50 miles an hour, 80 kilometers per hour, into blind blackness, uttered an astonished spectator. Surely no one would be foolhardy enough to try the Kandahar run at night, they thought. why the entire length of the trail was dotted with trees marked by X's, a skier's sign that someone had not safely navigated around the natural obstacle. Logic dictated that no one would attempt to ski the slope at night, but what the group had seen contradicted that reasoning. Not only had they seen the skier for themselves just minutes ago, but the ski tracks remained behind, cut clearly into the powder. By the next morning, word of the incredible sighting had spread among the rest of the skiers on the mountain. Several people who had been out walking at the edge of the 1.6 kilometer, 1 mile long run late that night also reported having seen the phantom skier. They all confirmed that he was not carrying a lantern, and yet his tracks, readily visible in Saturday morning's daylight, indicated that the entity had successfully made his way to the ski village at the bottom of the mountain, an accomplishment that no human being could ever hope to make. What so many credible witnesses had seen simply could not have happened, unless, like so many other ski hills, Grouse Mountain was haunted.